Northern Montana Territory, October 12, 1883. Thomas Whitfield, a newly arrived British settler from Yorkshire, started building what the entire Whitefish settlement would soon call the stupidest structure they'd ever seen. He wasn't just building a cabin. He was building a cabin with a second complete roof floating 18 inches above the first one, creating what looked like a massive wooden hat perched awkwardly on top of a perfectly good home. Samuel Hendricks, the settlement's founding homesteader who'd survived 7 Montana winters, stood watching with his arms crossed and shook his head. "That's the damnedest waste of good lumber I've ever witnessed," he said loud enough for the whole timber yard to hear. "Boy's gonna freeze to death under all that British nonsense." Margaret Olson, who ran the general store and knew every family's winter supplies down to the last nail, was even more direct. "Mr. Whitfield, that's 300 board feet you're hanging in the air doing nothing. 300 feet that could be walls or floors or firewood. What exactly do you think that second roof's gonna do besides catch snow?" Even Thomas's own neighbor, a German immigrant named Klaus Reinhardt, who'd built 4 solid cabins across 2 territories, tried to talk sense into him. "Thomas, I build homes 15 years now. This design, it makes no sense. The heat, it rises, yes? It goes straight up and out. You're building a chimney made of wood, trapping nothing, wasting everything. Please, let me show you how we do it." But Thomas Whitfield just smiled politely, tipped his flat cap, and kept working. What did this British newcomer understand about Montana winter survival that experienced frontier builders with decades of collective knowledge had completely missed? Before we reveal the ingenious physics behind Thomas's design that would save lives within 60 days, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what historical building technique you'd like me to investigate next. Thomas's method looked wrong from every angle the experienced settlers examined it. He built his primary cabin exactly as expected, 12 by 16 feet, walls of tight-fitted spruce logs, chinked with clay and moss, a standard stone fireplace on the north wall. Nobody questioned that part. Then came the madness. He constructed a complete second roof structure 18 inches above his primary roof. Not a simple covering, but an entire independent roof system with its own ridgeline, its own pitch, its own rafters and shingles. The gap between the 2 roofs wasn't filled, wasn't stuffed with anything, just empty air running the full length and width of the cabin. Samuel Hendricks brought 3 other settlement leaders to Thomas's building site in early November. "Listen here, Whitfield," Samuel said, his voice carrying that patient tone men use when they're trying to save a fool from himself. "I've seen Englishmen try to bring their fancy ideas to Montana before. They all learned the hard way. That air gap you're creating? In January, when it's 30 below, wind's gonna howl right through there, suck every bit of warmth straight out of your cabin. You're basically building a wind tunnel over your family's heads." James Murphy, an Irishman who'd logged the area for 6 years, pointed at the exposed rafters. "And another thing, that bottom roof, the one that actually matters, it's gonna collect moisture from your cabin heat. Then that moisture freezes in your air gap. Come spring, you've got ice dams, rot, structural failure. I've seen it happen to experimental builds. Traditional single roof with proper ventilation, that's what works here." Thomas listened respectfully to every word, nodded his understanding, and then went back to installing his second roof. "I appreciate your concern, gentlemen," he said quietly, "but I'll see it through." Margaret Olson calculated the cost publicly at the general store. "That's $42 in extra lumber, $16 in additional nails, and probably 60 hours of labor time he could have spent cutting firewood." "For what? For air? Come February, when his family's burning through double the wood trying to heat that drafty thing, they'll understand why we tried to stop him." By late November, Thomas had completed his bizarre double-roof cabin. The structure stood there looking like a joke, the upper roof hovering uselessly above the lower one, a monument to immigrant stubbornness and wasted resources. Children from the settlement walked by to stare at it. Adults made it a punchline. "You build like Whitfield?" became the local insult for doing something backwards. Klaus Reinhardt stopped offering advice. and just felt sorry for Thomas's wife, Catherine, and their 2 young children. "They will learn," he told Samuel Hendricks, sadly. "The cold, it teaches everyone." What Thomas understood, and what his critics had never considered, was the science of dead airspace as thermal insulation. Thomas had grown up in the Yorkshire Dales, where stone cottages routinely incorporated double-wall construction and cavity spaces to combat the brutal North Atlantic dampness and cold. His grandfather had been a master stone mason who'd explained the principle to him as a boy. Air, when trapped and prevented from moving, becomes one of nature's finest insulators. Not because air itself stops heat, but because still air stops convection, the movement of heat through fluids and gases. A dead air gap of 18 inches, properly sealed at the edges but open enough to prevent moisture buildup, creates an insulation barrier that solid wood alone could never match. The physics are straightforward. Heat transfer happens 3 ways: conduction through solid materials, convection through moving fluids and gases, and radiation through space. Thomas's single-roof neighbors were fighting heat loss primarily through conduction. Their cabin heat would warm the wooden roof, and that heat would conduct straight through the logs into the freezing exterior air. Wood has a thermal conductivity of about 0.12 BTU per hour, per square foot, per degree Fahrenheit, per inch of thickness. A typical 6-inch log roof loses heat fast. Thomas's double roof design attacked all 3 heat transfer methods simultaneously. The 18-inch air gap between his 2 roofs created a massive dead air space. With both roof edges properly sealed but ventilated through small gaps at the eaves, the air in that cavity couldn't form the convection currents that would carry heat away. Heat rising from his cabin would warm the lower roof, but then that heat faced 18 inches of still air before reaching the upper roof. Air's thermal conductivity is only 0.015 BTU per hour per square foot per degree Fahrenheit per inch, 8 times better than wood. 18 inches of dead air provided insulation equivalent to 12 feet of solid timber. The lower roof stayed warm from cabin heat, preventing ice dam formation. The upper roof stayed cold, matching the exterior temperature, preventing snow from melting and refreezing. The cavity between them served as both insulator and vapor barrier. This wasn't Thomas inventing something new. Scandinavian settlers had built double-wall log homes with sawdust-filled cavities. Scottish Highland cottages used double stone walls with air gaps. Korean Ondal heating systems incorporated dead air principles. Plains Indian winter lodges used double hide walls with grass insulation between layers. The principle was ancient and proven across multiple cultures. Thomas had simply adapted Yorkshire stone cottage cavity wall technology to Montana log construction. His critics weren't stupid. Samuel Hendricks was right that heat rises. Margaret Olson was right that the extra lumber cost real money. Klaus Reinhardt was absolutely correct that moisture management mattered. Where they erred was assuming that empty space was wasted space, that if you couldn't see insulation material filling a gap, the gap wasn't insulating. They'd learned frontier survival through practical experience, but never encountered the building physics that British stonemasons had perfected over centuries of combat with North Atlantic weather. Thomas built his primary roof with tongue-and-groove planking instead of round logs, creating an airtight seal. He then constructed the second roof frame using lighter lumber, 2x6 rafters instead of full logs, reducing weight and cost while maintaining the critical 18-inch cavity. He sealed the edges where the 2 roof systems met the walls using overlapping boards that prevented wind from entering the cavity while leaving small gaps at the soffits for minimal ventilation to prevent condensation buildup. The entire upper roof structure added only 800 pounds to the cabin, well within the load capacity of his walls. Total material cost was $38, not Margaret's calculated $42. Labor time was 72 hours spread across 3 weeks. For that investment, Thomas created an insulation system that would outperform any single roof cabin in the territory by a factor of 3 to 1 on heat retention. December 18th, 1883. The blizzard arrived without the usual warning signs. Temperature had been hovering around 20 degrees for a week, cold but manageable, typical early winter weather. Then the barometric pressure dropped like a stone. By noon, the thermometer at the general store read 8 degrees. By 4 o'clock, it showed -12. By midnight, it hit -34 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind came screaming down from Canada at 40 miles per hour, driving the effective temperature to -70. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see your own fence line. This wasn't a normal Montana cold snap. This was a killer. Samuel Hendricks burned through a cord and a half of firewood in the first 36 hours, trying to keep his cabin above freezing. His family wore every piece of clothing they owned, layered 3 deep, and still shivered under wool blankets. The single-roof cabin that had served him for 7 winters couldn't hold heat against this onslaught. Interior temperature, measured at 5 feet from his roaring fireplace, struggled to reach 42 degrees. Near the walls, frost formed on the inside of the logs. His youngest daughter, Emma, 8 years old, developed a cough on the second day that worried him deeply. Klaus Reinhardt's situation was even worse. His cabin, slightly larger than Samuel's but built with the same proven single-roof design, couldn't maintain temperature above 38 degrees, despite burning wood constantly. His wife, Greta, couldn't feel her fingers even wearing 2 pairs of wool gloves. Their elderly father, who lived with them, stopped getting out of bed because moving meant exposure to air that felt like knives. Klaus himself developed frostbite on 3 toes just from walking around his own cabin. He'd survived harsh winters, but nothing like this. Margaret Olson shut the general store after the second day because the building was uninhabitable. Even with the big cast-iron stove running full blast, the interior temperature never climbed above 32 degrees. Ink froze in the bottles. Eggs in their crates froze solid and cracked. She moved her family into the storage room in the back and prayed the storm would break. James Murphy, the experienced Irish logger, nearly lost 2 fingers to frostbite while trying to split more firewood in the storm. His cabin temperature dropped to 36 degrees despite heroic efforts to feed his fireplace. The wind found every gap in his chinking, every imperfect seal, and exploited it mercilessly. His children huddled together for warmth while he and his wife took turns staying awake to maintain the fire throughout the night. The settlement was in crisis. Every cabin fought the same losing battle. Heat rose from fireplaces and stoves, hit the single-layer roof, conducted straight through the wood into the void, and disappeared into the screaming wind. Families burned through their carefully rationed winter wood supplies at catastrophic rates. The storm showed no signs of breaking. On the morning of December 21st, the 4th day of the blizzard, Samuel Hendricks made a desperate decision. His daughter Emma's cough had worsened into a fever. She needed warmth, real warmth, not the inadequate 40-degree air his cabin could provide. He wrapped her in blankets, bundled himself against the cold, and carried her through waist-deep snow the 100 yards to Thomas Whitfield's cabin. The walk nearly killed him. Wind hit like a physical weapon. Snow stung exposed skin. The 100 yards felt like a mile. Samuel was gasping and half frozen when he pounded on Thomas's door. Catherine Whitfield opened it immediately, pulling Samuel and Emma inside. The warmth hit Samuel like a wall. His frosted eyebrows thawed instantly. His numb face began to tingle. He looked at the thermometer hanging on Thomas's wall and couldn't believe what he saw. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The Whitfield children, 7-year-old Robert and 5-year-old Anne, were playing on the floor in normal clothes, not huddled under blankets. Catherine wore a simple dress, comfortable, not layered with everything she owned. The fireplace burned at a moderate rate, not the roaring inferno Samuel had been maintaining. Thomas sat at the table working on a carving project, calm as if it were spring. Samuel stood there dripping melting snow, holding his sick daughter, staring at that thermometer, unable to form words. Thomas got up, took Emma gently, and laid her near the fireplace on a cushioned bench. "She'll be fine here," Thomas said quietly. "Catherine, could you make some hot broth?" Samuel found his voice. How? How is it this warm?" I've been burning wood like it's kindling and I can't get above 40 degrees. You're sitting here comfortable and it's not even loud in here. I can't hear the wind. Thomas pointed up at his ceiling. The double roof. 18 inches of dead air between the interior and exterior roofs. The cavities trapping heat. Wind can't reach through it. Cold can't conduct through it fast enough to matter. My lower roof is warm, about 50 degrees on the exterior surface. My upper roof is cold, -30 like everything else. But that 18-inch gap between them is doing what 3 feet of solid wood couldn't do. It's insulating. Samuel walked to the wall and put his hand against the interior logs. They were warm to the touch, no frost, no ice. He looked at Thomas's modest fire, maybe a quarter the size of the inferno he'd been maintaining in his own fireplace. You're burning a fraction of the wood I am. Thomas nodded. About 1/3, maybe less. The cabin holds heat instead of bleeding it out through the roof. I load the fireplace twice a day, morning and evening. That's it. Before we continue with how this discovery spread through the settlement and saved multiple lives, hit that like button and comment below, telling me what other frontier survival techniques you want me to investigate. The knowledge Thomas brought from Yorkshire was about to revolutionize how this entire territory built shelter. Over the next 3 days of the blizzard, Thomas's cabin became a refuge. Klaus Reinhardt showed up on December 22nd with his wife and elderly father. Margaret Olsen arrived with her 2 children on the 23rd. James Murphy brought his whole family on Christmas Eve, half carried through the drifts by Thomas and Samuel. The Whitfield cabin wasn't large, but it was warm, genuinely warm, and that warmth meant survival. Thomas never once mentioned that he'd been right and they'd been wrong. He just made room, shared his food, and kept the fire going. Samuel Hendricks had brought a thermometer from his own cabin, one he trusted. He hung it in Thomas's cabin next to Thomas's thermometer. Both read exactly the same. 66 degrees on Christmas morning, while the exterior temperature sat at -31. Samuel then walked back to his own cabin, now empty, and checked the thermometer there. 37 degrees with no fire running. His cabin had lost almost all its heat in just 12 hours of no fire. He loaded his fireplace, got it roaring hot, and watched the thermometer. After 2 hours of burning wood at a rate that would exhaust his supply in a week, his cabin reached 44 degrees. He let the fire die again and watched. Within 4 hours, the temperature dropped back to 39. The cabin couldn't hold heat. It was a sieve. He trudged back to Thomas's cabin and found Thomas banking his fireplace for the evening. Samuel watched him do it. Thomas raked the coals into a compact pile, laid 3 medium logs on top, adjusted the damper to slow the burn, and walked away. "That'll hold until morning," Thomas said. "Should wake up to about 62 degrees. Samuel shook his head in wonder. "I need to understand this. I need to know exactly how you built that roof system." Thomas pulled out the sketches he'd made before construction. He walked Samuel through every measurement, every material choice, every ceiling technique. The primary roof, tongue and groove planking, 8-inch boards, creating an airtight initial seal, a layer of tar paper for additional moisture protection. Then the cavity frame, 2x6 studs erected 18 inches above the primary roof, creating the dead airspace. Critical detail, the cavity wasn't completely sealed. Small gaps at the eaves allowed minimal air exchange, preventing moisture buildup that could lead to rot or ice formation. Finally, the upper roof, standard shingles on plank sheathing, built to shed snow and rain, staying cold to prevent snow melt and ice dams. Klaus Reinhardt studied the sketches with the intensity of a man whose life depended on understanding. "This cavity, this airspace, it is the key?" Thomas nodded. "Dead air. Not moving air that would create convection and carry heat away. Dead air, trapped, still. Air is one of nature's finest insulators when you can keep it motionless. 18 inches gives you insulation value equivalent to more wood than you could practically put up there." James Murphy asked the practical question. "Cost? Real cost? Material and labor?" Thomas had kept careful records. $38 in lumber beyond standard cabin construction. $22 in additional nails, tar paper, and hardware. $60 total. Maybe 72 hours of labor spread across 3 weeks. But I'm already ahead on fuel savings. I'm burning 1/3 the wood of a standard cabin. That means my winter wood supply will last 3 times longer, or I need 1/3 less wood. In labor time cutting and hauling firewood alone, I'm ahead by the end of the first winter. Margaret Olson did the math publicly on December 26th when everyone was gathered in Thomas's cabin. I calculated $42 before. I was wrong. Thomas spent $60 total. But let's look at fuel consumption. Samuel, how much wood have you burned in the last 8 days? Samuel looked pained. 2 1/4 cords. At this rate, I'll burn 18 cords this winter. I cut 12. Margaret turned to Thomas. And you? Thomas checked his woodpile through the window. 3/4 of a cord in 8 days. Projects to about 7 cords for the winter. I cut 8. Margaret wrote the numbers on a slate. Samuel's burning 2.6 times more wood. If we value wood cutting labor at fair rates, Thomas saves about 90 hours of labor per winter, just in reduced fuel needs. 90 hours is worth at least $45 at 50 cents an hour. He paid $60 extra for construction. He breaks even by the middle of winter too, then profits every winter after that for the life of the structure. Plus, his family isn't freezing. Klaus asked the question everyone was thinking. Thomas, would you help me build this? Would you share exactly how to do it? Thomas didn't hesitate. Of course. When the storm breaks, I'll help anyone who wants to learn. This isn't some secret. This is survival technique. Everyone deserves warm shelter. The storm finally broke on December 27th. 9 days of brutal cold, killing wind, and relentless snow. The settlement took stock. 2 elderly residents had died from cold-related illness in cabins that couldn't maintain life-sustaining temperatures. 4 children, including Samuel's daughter Emma, had developed severe respiratory infections from prolonged exposure to near-freezing interior temperatures. 17 families had burned through more than half their winter wood supplies in just 9 days. The settlement faced a genuine crisis. But everyone who'd sheltered in Thomas Whitfield's cabin during those final days had survived in comfort. Emma Hendricks recovered completely after 3 days in 65-degree warmth. The elderly father of Klaus Reinhardt, who'd stopped speaking and eating in the 38-degree cabin, rallied within 24 hours of entering Thomas's warm home. The evidence wasn't anecdotal or debatable. It was empirical, measured, witnessed by everyone. Samuel Hendricks stood up at the settlement meeting on January 2nd, 1884, and said the words publicly. I was wrong. Thomas Whitfield tried to tell us, and we mocked him. His design works. It works better than anything I've seen in 7 years on this frontier. We need to learn from him. The adoption was immediate and enthusiastic. By late January, 17 families had requested Thomas's help designing double roof additions to their existing cabins. Thomas spent his days sketching, measuring, advising. He charged nothing for consultation. Klaus Reinhardt built the first modification in early February, essentially constructing a second roof over his existing cabin. The temperature difference was immediate and dramatic. Interior temperature jumped from 42 degrees to 63 degrees with the same fireplace burn rate. By the end of winter 1884, 23 cabins in the Whitefish settlement had double roof systems. Some built entirely new structures incorporating Thomas's design from the foundation up. Others modified existing cabins by adding the second roof structure over their original roofs. James Murphy created a 24-inch air cavity instead of 18 for his larger cabin. His structure maintained 69 degrees through the next cold snap. Margaret Olson built a double roof system over the general store, reporting 40% reduction in fuel costs. Samuel Hendricks added double wall construction to his walls, creating 6-inch air cavities. His cabin became the warmest in the settlement, maintaining 71 to 73 degrees. The economic impact rippled through the community. Families who'd struggled to cut and haul enough winter wood could now survive on half their previous fuel needs. Children's health improved measurably. The settlement midwife reported 60% fewer cases of winter respiratory illness in double-roof homes compared to traditional single-roof cabins. By winter of 1885, 43 cabins across the broader Whitefish territory had adopted double-roof construction. The technique spread through word of mouth and direct observation. Former critics became advocates. Samuel Hendricks told newcomers, "Build with a double roof from the start." The Englishman was right. Margaret Olson kept detailed fuel consumption records and published them in the territorial newspaper. Double-roof cabins consumed 42 to 60% less wood, depending on cabin size and construction quality. Thomas Whitfield lived in his double-roof cabin until his death on March 3, 1921, at the age of 71. The structure stood solid and warm for 38 years of Montana winters. The cabin still stands today, maintained by Thomas's great-great-granddaughter, now listed on the Montana Historical Register as the Whitfield Double Roof Cabin, pioneer example of cavity wall insulation principles applied to log construction. Modern thermal imaging confirms what Thomas knew by instinct. The 18-inch dead air cavity creates an insulation barrier with an R value of approximately R15, equivalent to modern fiberglass batting of similar thickness. Heat loss through the roof is reduced by 72% compared to single-roof log construction. Contemporary research has validated Thomas's principles. The U.S. Department of Energy's studies on thermal mass and dead air insulation specifically cite cavity wall and cavity roof systems as highly efficient passive heating strategies. Universities studying historical building techniques have measured surviving double-roof frontier structures and found thermal performance exceeding modern building code minimums for cold climate construction. The technique nearly disappeared. By the 1920s, with commercial insulation materials available, traditional double-roof log building fell out of practice. Many surviving examples were demolished. Knowledge that had saved lives was almost lost because it seemed primitive compared to modern materials. But the physics doesn't care about fashion. Dead air trapped in a cavity insulates just as effectively whether formed by two log roofs or by modern studs. Thomas's design wasn't primitive. It was sophisticated application of thermodynamic principles using available materials. The mockery he endured came from experienced men who knew frontier survival but didn't understand heat transfer physics. When Thomas introduced a design that violated their practical experience, they rejected it. The blizzard of December 1883 proved Thomas right through brutal, empirical testing. His cabin maintained 66 to 68 degrees, while traditional cabins struggled to reach 40. The thermometers didn't lie. Emma Hendricks's recovery in warm air after becoming dangerously ill in cold air wasn't debatable. The traditional knowledge Thomas brought from Yorkshire, adapted to Montana log construction, outperformed accumulated frontier wisdom, not because experience was worthless, but because understanding principles allows innovation that experience alone cannot generate. Samuel Hendricks survived 7 Montana winters before meeting Thomas. He knew how to build a cabin that worked adequately. But adequate meant burning massive amounts of wood and accepting 40-degree interior temperatures as normal. Thomas knew the physics of thermal insulation and engineered a solution that transformed adequate into excellent. Modern sustainable building movements have rediscovered these principles. Breathing walls, cavity insulation, thermal mass strategies, passive heating systems, all echo what Thomas built in 1883. Contemporary green building consultants recommend dead air spaces for insulation in situations where conventional insulation is impractical or where moisture management is critical. The cutting edge of modern sustainable architecture is relearning what frontier innovators figured out by combining traditional knowledge with practical necessity. The arrogance comes easy, looking backward. We assume historical people were less intelligent, less capable of sophisticated thought, because they lacked our technology. But intelligence and technology aren't the same thing. Thomas Whitfield understood thermodynamics well enough to engineer a passive heating system that modern building codes would approve. He did it with hand tools and frontier lumber. The men who mocked him weren't stupid. They were experienced, successful survivors who'd outlasted harsh conditions for years. But experience without understanding of underlying principles creates rigid thinking. They knew what worked but couldn't imagine alternatives because they didn't understand the mechanisms. Thomas understood mechanisms, so he could innovate. The lesson extends beyond log cabins. Traditional knowledge, techniques developed over generations in specific environments, often contain sophisticated solutions to complex problems. When those solutions look primitive or backwards to modernize, the appropriate response isn't mockery. It's investigation. What problem is this solving? Why does it work? What principles is it leveraging? The near loss of double roof construction knowledge is a reminder that progress isn't linear. We don't automatically retain everything useful from the past while adding new knowledge. Sometimes we discard solutions that work because they don't fit contemporary aesthetic or because we don't understand their value. The recovery requires humility, the willingness to learn from people who lived in different circumstances, the recognition that intelligence and problem-solving ability aren't unique to any era or culture. Thomas Whitfield's cabin still stands on its original foundation in Whitefish, Montana. The double roof still provides superior insulation. The dead air cavity still traps heat exactly as Thomas explained in 1883. Visitors can see the construction details, measure the temperature differential, and understand empirically why the neighbors laughed and why the blizzard proved them wrong. The structure is a monument not just to one man's intelligence, but to the value of understanding principles over accepting conventional wisdom unquestioningly. Give this video a like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what other historical building techniques you want me to investigate. Next time, we're diving into how a Norwegian immigrant in Minnesota developed a heated floor system using principles from traditional Nordic design that kept his family warm through the brutal winter of 1888, while his neighbors' children suffered from frostbite in conventional cabins. You won't believe how simple his solution was, and how completely the local builders dismissed it until tragedy forced them to pay attention. The story involves a deadly cold snap, a near-fatal accident, and a heating method that's now being used in modern luxury homes without most people knowing it came from a frontier farmer who couldn't afford conventional heating. See you there.